Okay, so the last talk is by Jamil Nasser. He uses he, him pronouns. The title of his talk is In the Deadly Exchange, U.S. Police Cross Trainings with Israel's Military. So kick it off, and I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left and 1 minute left.
Hey, sorry about that. Okay, good evening, everybody. Marhaba, salam alaikum. Thanks so much to the organizers for this opportunity to speak among a lot of really inspiring people, and also for making a seat at the table for Palestine. And I want to shout out Kristen for rocking a Palestinian flag in pretty much every Zoom call we've ever had. So my name is Jamil. I'm a diaspora Palestinian. I'm based in Phoenix, and I organize with Arizona Palestine Solidarity Alliance, or APSA for short. So our group is an anti-militarization network focused on the human rights of Palestinians, but we also look to the border and indigenous issues here to draw parallels, both direct and indirect, between the militarization of the southern border and the tactics and technology that is implemented in Palestine and then sold here to the Department of Defense and US Border Customs and Protection. Increasingly, we've been more and more focused on the relationship between law enforcement and the Israeli military, and that's going to be the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to be sharing info today about that relationship between US and Israel in terms of police exchanges and cross-training programs. So keep at the top of your mind that Palestinians have been the subject of a 70-year campaign of settler colonialism, land theft, occupation, and racist policy. We also need to keep in mind that Palestinians have been resisting these forms of violence for 70 years, and that their strength is both resolute and a source of deep inspiration for freedom fighters around the world. We also need to be conscious that the greater Israeli society and status quo that consistently rejects the Palestinian calls for equality is not the same as the version that we see here in the US of people reacting to and opposing the Black uprising and Black Lives Matter. I mean, I'm talking about the All Lives Matter crowd here. But the common thread between them is that these reactionary classes are coming from the same place of ignorance, privilege, attachment to capitalist and nationalist ideology, and this deeply entrenched ideology of white supremacy, which we know to be an absolute moral failing. So with that said, I'm here today to outline a police training program that many people aren't aware of, and it's not people's fault for being unaware of it, because these exchange programs are really, really secretive. And I'm talking about the exchange programs between the US and Israel. And before I get into the meat of this stuff, I think we need to be rooted in the reality that, for US policing, like the history of it, goes way back to the slave patrols and a culture of white supremacist law enforcement that set out to protect private property, which, included human beings. So military tactics of controlling and dehumanizing people of color has been a thing in the US since long before Israel became a state in 1948. So this isn't a direct cause and effect relationship at all. We need to be a little more nuanced about that. So the question we have in front of us is, how have these cross trainings and the special relationship between the US and Israel contributed to or exacerbated an existing police force, which has always been aggressive towards communities of color and poor communities on the whole, and never been held accountable for their crimes? More specifically, what profiling tactics, what crowd control techniques, what technology and other oppressive strategies are our local PD learning from the Israeli military, who we know routinely kill Palestinians every single day with impunity? So Israeli armed forces, including the military and including the police, have an incredibly well-documented history of violence and grave human rights abuses against Palestinians, particularly in the areas of racial profiling, surveillance, mistreatment of prisoners, and suppression of social movements. And it's really been since 9/11 that these cross trainings, these police exchanges really kicked into gear as Israel saw an opportunity, like on the world stage, to tout themselves as this, counterterrorism expert. And they began marketing themselves as the go-to state for thought leadership on things like counterinsurgency. And with US taxpayers contributing $3.8 billion per year in military aid to Israel, there's a lot of money for individual states to piggy bank on through things like seminars, things like trade shows that are linked to defense contracting in the greater military industrial complex. So that figure I decided, $4 billion per year, I'm rounding it up a little bit, in military aid. So this goes to what we know to be an apartheid regime. So I'm going to slow down a little bit. Sorry, I get carried away here. This goes to what we know is an apartheid regime with countless human rights abuses against Palestinians. But it's also going to a country who is one of the most advanced, nuclear armed, military nations in the world. In other words, they don't need a cent of military aid from anybody. So this is another area where we need to be calling for defunding to Israel's military machine and reallocating those taxpayer dollars towards helping everyday people here and providing reparations to those who we've committed endless damage to in the global south. And if you go online, there's a calculator where you can basically see that $3.8 billion per year kind of dissected out per state. And I think it's something like $56 million of Arizona budget goes to Israeli, goes to this big chunk. And when you divide that up by the population in Arizona, I mean, that's literally $20 per year out of every single taxpayer's thing. So it's very much like money out of your pocket that's going to this, horrendous state. So, US law enforcement agencies, so this includes state and local police departments, as well as federal agencies like ICE. They've participated in these exchange programs with the Israeli military and police forces. And they usually send police that are in high positions of power. So we're talking about people like police chiefs in a major city, or executive assistants to the police, like the number 2 in the rank, sheriffs, CBP agents, like those kinds of people. So this is not like your typical beat cop who's riding around in a police cruiser all day, that they're investing and sending money to Israel for training. They don't send those people. They're sending people who have influence over a department, presumably, so they can implement these teachings from the top down. So while there are a couple of different US-Israel police exchange programs out there, the biggest one by far is called the National Counterterrorism Seminar, so the NCTS program. And this program was created and is managed by the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL for short. So the ADL is an advocacy group with a lot of influence who work on campaigns and research that combats anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism in the US. And while the ADL has done some good work in terms of raising the awareness of the increasing problem of genuine anti-Semitism throughout the US, especially as we've seen this rise in right-wing neo-fascist movements, they're also one of the most anti-Palestinian and Islamophobic spheres of influence out there. I mean, since 9/11, the ADL has been increasingly involved in the war on terror and utilized their influence to target legitimate critics of Israel and wage Israeli state propaganda while going into bed with very conservative, very right-wing elements in the US, while also being an ally of neoliberal institutions of power. So they play that whole crossing the aisle game very skillfully. And throughout our group's research, APSA, and the research of a lot of other Palestinian justice groups, we have identified by name, at least 3 or 4 central Arizona law enforcement officials, chief executives, and departments that have participated in these cross trainings in Israel. And we know Israel is an occupying military juggernaut, right? With countless human rights abuses and constantly disregarding and murdering Palestinian lives. So we make this information public to the community So that groups in Phoenix like BLM Phoenix Metro and Poder in Action and many others who are fighting for abolition and defunding the police can understand those connections and how we can come together to support a common goal. So one of the big questions becomes, what can an occupying, unaccountable military possibly teach to our police forces? So if folks in Tucson are interested in researching this, like our group APSA would be happy to help out with that work and provide some guidance. So feel free to reach out through social media. You can also contact Tucson's chapter of APSA as well, or me directly, apsaphoenix@gmail.com. I know there's a lot of Tucson community here. So I can say that I did receive a report from Jewish Voice for Peace's Deadly Exchange campaign with a list of 2018 police executives who participated in that NCTS program I was talking about earlier. And I don't know if he's your current police chief, but Chris Magnus, who either at one time was a police chief, not that long ago, this was 2018, and probably still is, was on that trip, along with Phoenix's executive assistant to the police chief. So that's likely something that Tucson radical community and the greater community needs to know about. In the past, justice groups have, after finding out this type of information, pressured their city councils to ban these cross trainings with varying degrees of success. I mean, most of the time it doesn't even get heard on the floor, but it's one way to raise awareness, right? And that is one strategy groups can take beyond informing the public about these cross-training trips. And generally speaking, I mean, like my group is very much interested in deflating the neoliberal image many have of Israel as either like a benign actor or a good actor in world affairs, especially. So we see that there's a very clear exchanging of strategies to tamp down on people of color in the US and also perpetuate this occupation in Palestine. And so many weapons of war are actually tested among the occupied people of Palestine. And we're talking about things like drones that drop tear gas on people. I think maybe the first time a lot of us saw that was a couple of years back in Tijuana, when migrants were trying to claim asylum. And you've also got security fences, surveillance capabilities, these LRAD sound cannons, etc., all this kind of stuff. I mean, this is all stuff that is used to terrorize Palestinians by the IDF, Israel Defense Forces. But then it's marketed to militaries and law enforcement around the world. And the IDF is especially heinous because they barely ever use rubber bullets. I mean, there's zero accountability, zero moral conscience, and there's the attitude that they don't see Palestinians as human beings. And you, on top of that, have a mass buy-in from the Israeli public that these strategies are necessary to quell, quote unquote, terrorism. So the reality is that these are strategies that disrupt popular Palestinian resistance. And you can see that there is a natural shared struggle between Palestinians fighting a racist, occupying system of apartheid and Black people here in the US fighting a racist institution which devalues their lives, as evidenced by all of these police killings and so many other institutions that rob us. So another really great find that Jewish Voice for Peace uncovered is that the ADL is also sending ICE and CBP officials on these trips. So when the abolition of ICE became a community, a big community demand, this shows you how hypocritical the ADL is when it comes to the immigration justice movement. Because on one hand, the ADL was publicly advocating against kids being in cages and family separations. But with the other hand, they have absolutely no problem with Palestinian kids in cages, being detained out of their homes in the middle of the night. I mean, sometimes these kids are as young as 11, 12 years old.
5 minutes.
Sorry?
5 more minutes.
Oh, okay, cool. Thanks. And this is all done with no due process, right? So this is a terrorizing strategy against Palestinian bodies. In fact, each year, approximately 500 to 700 Palestinian children are detained and prosecuted in the Israeli military court system. And the most severe charge for any of those is stone throwing. And if you know anything about Palestinians, that is like a rite of passage in the culture. So, from these public record requests, like getting back to these exchanges a little bit, our group and many others have learned that the ADL's police exchange trips involve involve US policing, meaning that Phoenix and Tucson police, we know for a fact, meet with representatives while they're on these trips. And these are the same bodies and agencies that are responsible for designing and carrying out all these human rights abuses that straight up murder Palestinian people. As well as the other thing they do is that they'll visit all of these sites with Israeli intelligence agencies, police, and the military, where these human rights violations often occur when we're talking about places like prisons, checkpoints, and border crossings. So, to summarize, we really just need to be asking ourselves, our local law enforcement, our local representatives, and those who are targeted and terrorized by these systems, I think the following questions. One, why should Israel be any kind of leader or model or case study for US police? Number two, what tactics, strategies, and weaponry boomerang back from Israel to US soil as a result of these dangerous cross trainings? Number three, how can we engage in tactics that will sever the horrible relationship this country has to Israel, which we know to be a rogue apartheid state responsible for the oppression of the Palestinian people? And the fourth and final question is, how can the American Black struggle and the Palestinian struggle come together in a material, non-opportunistic way that seeks to raise the tide of revolution in these critical times where action is everything? Thank you very much.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That was amazing. So we also have a Q&A for this talk, so the facilitator can get on, and we have enough time for 2 or 3 questions.
I haven't, so are the also, oh, you were talking about APSA, right? The organization you were saying that we could refer to for help in these and information. You also give an email, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was, can you repeat it?
Yeah, sure. So, for APSA, APSA was founded in Tucson, and it's been active for a few years, and the Phoenix chapter has been kicking around for a couple years. So you can email myself, and I will route you to the right place. You can hit me up at APSA, APSA Phoenix, @gmail.com. I don't have the Tucson's email address on the top of my head. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You just search for Arizona Palestine Solidarity Alliance, or search for AZ2 Palestine, and that's the number 2, and you'll find us.
Great, thank you. And you also mentioned a source talking about Magnus's participation in the exchange program.
Mm-hmm.
What was that exactly?
Sorry, what was the question?
That you had mentioned a source talking about Magnus's participation in that.
Yeah. So one of the groups that's done the most research on this in terms of actually fulfilling these public record requests and FOIAs, because this is very hard information to pull up. I mean, it's not something the ADL wants to make available publicly, I mean, for obvious reasons. But in 2018, basically these trips happen like several times a year, and they'll usually be regional. So like in 2018, there was like a Southwest version of this trip, which included high-ranking police from California, Nevada, New Mexico, and AZ, and a couple other places. So we know in 2018 that in Phoenix, our executive police chief, Michael Kurtenbach, went on this trip, and he went on the same trip that Tucson's police chief did as well. And not only do we have Jewish Voice for Peace provided a record of the public record request, the ADL also is really stupid and it creates these brochures basically, and the brochures are distributed to all the people who are going on the trip. And it's basically like, it's weird. It's like a creepy yearbook of all the cops that are going on this trip. So it'll have like a page for each cop. So it'll have like, Phoenix's police chief, Michael Kurtenbach, had his name, his picture, and like all these questions, like, why are you so excited to go to Israel? Like, what are you looking forward to the most? What do you have in common with Israeli people? All this really horrible propaganda. But Jewish Voice for Peace is so good that they got copies of all these brochures in addition to public record requests. And that's how we know that they went on these trips. The other thing our group did personally was we just picked up the phone and called police departments all around central Arizona and got in touch with the chief's office, and we would ask them straight up, like, hey, can you confirm that you went on this trip? And they have no shame about it. I mean, they're absolutely willing to tell you who went on the trip, when they went on the trip. And we also try to find out if they're planning on going on future trips, so that we can apply that pressure before they actually go on the trip, so we're not always like reacting to it.
And on that note, can you speak to what you know about organizing tactics specifically in Arizona about that and preventing that exchange?
Well, as far as I know, and look, I have only a limited amount of information about the total summation of what's being organized. I've never seen, at least in the Phoenix area, any kind of pressure on the police departments or city councils to do anything about these trainings or even bring them up. So that is what our group is trying to take leadership on. One of the things that we want to do with this information is, get a petition going, informing the public that this is happening. I mean, we're already in communication with a lot of groups here who are on the same page about abolition and about defunding the police, especially in this like very critical moment. And we need to be careful. I mean, we can't come out here and saying like, oh, the reason that these police officers are out here with riot gear and all of this high-tech weaponry is because of Israel. No, that's absolutely not true. It's not a cause and effect relationship, but there is a connection there. And while we don't know precisely what happens on these trips, like we can certainly put it out that it doesn't help, and it perpetuates this the occupation of the Palestinian people, and literally it's a really strange relationship, because as far as we know, our police doesn't go and train with other militaries. Our military goes and trains with other militaries all the time. I mean, that we know, but it is a unique thing for the U.S. police to be literally training with a foreign military police force. I mean, that is quite literally the militarization of our police.
Yeah. And then maybe a last one, although this could have been a similar answer. Someone was asking about that question on a more national level, especially after the last talk about getting outside of voting as our main action source. Like, what can we do you feel, as members of this nation, to try to improve the situation in Palestine?
Well, I think in this moment we need, as Palestinians and Palestinian justice advocates, we absolutely need to be contributing to the voice of defunding the police as a tactic and working to abolition, right? So I think I see that as the foremost thing that we can be doing is supporting the Black uprising in this moment, because we need to support our comrades in that fight. But at the same time, we know that in terms of militarism, global militarism, if we can reduce the piggy banks, then we can start to make a dent when it comes to say advocating for Palestinian liberation. The other tactic that I think people can do on an individual basis but also organize around is a tactic of BDS, which is boycott, divestment, and sanction. And this is critical because the Palestinian civil society put out a call to the rest of the world and said, the best thing you can do, the most effective thing you can do, is to alienate Israel on the world stage. It could be everything from not buying Israeli products in your grocery store, like the small acts that are very simple, to divest. Let's say you go to a university and they're attached to an Israeli tech company. Creating a campaign where you can divest, where you're calling on your university to divest from that. I mean, working all the way up to things like not allowing Israel to be in the Olympics, like treating it as what they are. This is an apartheid situation. We have a precedent for this in South Africa, right? The whole world came together and said, we absolutely cannot normalize this type of apartheid situation. So that is what those of us who advocate for Palestine in a real way are advocating for, tactics of BDS.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're running out of time, but thank you so much for internationalizing this whole dialogue. I think that's brilliant.